Chapter 1, the 100th birthday party. I jumped out of bed that morning with one question in my mind: sun or fog? Usually it was fog in Holland in January, dank, chill, and gray. But occasionally, on a rare and magic day, a white winter sun broke through. I leaned as far as I could from the single window in my bedroom. It was always hard to see the sky from the bayay. Blank brick walls looked back at me, the backs of other ancient buildings in this crowded center of Old Harlem. But up there, where my neck craned to see, above the crazy roofs and crooked chimneys, was a square of pale pearl sky. It was going to be a sunny day for the party. I attempted a little waltz as I took my new dress from the tipsy old wardrobe against the wall. Father's bedroom was directly under mine, but at 77, he slept soundly. That was one advantage to growing old, I thought, as I worked my arms into the sleeves and surveyed the effect in the mirror on the wardrobe door. Although some Dutch women in 1937 were wearing their skirts knee-length, mine was still a cautious 3 inches above my shoes. "You're not growing younger yourself," I reminded my reflection. Maybe it was the new dress that made me look more critically at myself than usual. 45 years old, unmarried, waistline long since vanished. My sister Betsy, though 7 years older than I, still had that slender grace that made people turn and look after her in the street. Heaven knows it wasn't her clothes. Our little watch shop had never made much money. But when Betsy put on a dress, something wonderful happened to it. On me, until Betsy caught up with them, hems sagged, stockings tore, and collars twisted. But today, I thought, standing back from the mirror as far as I could in the small room, the effect of dark maroon was very smart. Far below me, down on the street, the doorbell rang. Callers before 7 o'clock in the morning? I opened my bedroom door and plunged down the steep, twisting stairway. These stairs were an afterthought in this curious old house. Actually, it was 2 houses. The one in front was a typical tiny old Harlem structure, 3 stories high, 2 rooms deep, and only 1 room wide. At some unknown point in its long history, its rear wall had been knocked through to join it with the even thinner, steeper house in the back of it, which had only 3 rooms, one on top of the other, and this narrow corkscrew staircase squeezed between the 2. Quick as I was, Betsy was at the door ahead of me. An enormous spray of flowers filled the doorway. As Betsy took them, a small delivery boy appeared. "Nice day for the party, miss," he said, trying to peer past the flowers as though coffee and cake might already be set out. He would be coming to the party later, as indeed it seemed would all of Harlem. Betsy and I searched the bouquet for the card. "Pickwick!" we shouted together. Pickwick was an enormously wealthy customer who not only bought the very finest watches, but often came upstairs to the family part of the house above the shop. His real name was Herman Slurring. Pickwick was the name Betsy and I used between ourselves because he looked so incredibly like the illustrator's drawing in our copy of Dickens. Herman Slurring was without doubt the ugliest man in Harlem. Short, immensely fat, head bald as a Holland cheese. He was so wall-eyed that you were never quite sure whether he was looking at you or someone else, and as kind and generous as he was fearsome to look at. The flowers had come to the side door, the door the family used, opening onto a tiny alleyway, and Betsy and I carried them from the little hall into the shop. First was the workroom, where the watches and clocks were repaired. There was the high bench over which Father had bent for so many years, doing the delicate, painstaking work that was known as the finest in Holland. And there in the center of the room was my bench, and next to mine, Hans, the apprentice's, and against the wall, old Christoffel's. Beyond the workroom was the customer's part of the shop, with its glass case full of watches. All the wall clocks were striking 7 o'clock as Betsy and I carried the flowers in and looked for the most artistic spot to put them. Ever since childhood, I had loved to step into this room where 100 ticking voices welcomed me. It was still dark inside because the shutters had not been drawn back from the windows on the street. I unlocked the street door and stepped out onto the Bottle Jour Straat. The other shops up and down the narrow street were shuttered and silent. The opticians next door, the dress shop, the bakers, Veal's Furs across the street. I folded back our shutters and stood for a minute admiring the window display that Betsy and I had at last agreed upon. This window was always a great source of debate between us. I wanting to display as much of our stock as could be squeezed onto the shelf, and Betsy maintaining that 2 or 3 beautiful watches, with perhaps a piece of silk or satin swirled beneath, was more elegant and more inviting. But this time, the window satisfied us both. It held a collection of clocks and pocket watches, all at least 100 years old, borrowed for the occasion from friends and antique dealers all over the city. For today was the shop's 100th birthday. It was on this day in January 1837 that Father's father had placed in this window a sign, Ten Boom Watches. For the last 10 minutes, with a heavenly disregard for the precisions of passing time, the church bells of Haarlem had been purling out 7 o'clock. And now half a block away in the town square, the great bell of St. Bavo solemnly donged 7 times. I lingered in the street to count them, though it was cold in the January dawn. Of course, everyone in Haarlem had radios now, but I could remember when the life of the city had run on St. Bavo time, and only trainmen and others who needed to know the exact hour had come here to read the astronomical clock. Father would take the train to Amsterdam each week to bring back the time from the Naval Observatory, and it was a source of pride to him that the astronomical clock was never more than 2 seconds off in the 7 days. There it stood now as I stepped back into the shop, still tall, gleaming on its concrete block, but shorn now of eminence. The doorbell on the alley was ringing again. More flowers. So it went for an hour. Large bouquets and small ones, elaborate set pieces and homegrown plants in clay pots. For although the party was for the shop, the affection of a city was for Father. Haarlem's grand old man, they called him, and they were setting about to prove it. When the shop and the workmen would not hold another bouquet, Betsy and I started carrying them upstairs to the 2 rooms above the shop. Though it was 20 years since her death, these were still Tante Jan's rooms. Tante Jan's was Mother's older sister, and her presence lingered in the massive dark furniture she had left behind her. Betsy set down a pot of greenhouse-grown tulips and stepped back with a little cry of pleasure. "Corey, just look how much brighter." Poor Betsy. The Bayeux was so closed in by the houses around that the window plants she started each spring never grew enough to bloom. At 7:45, Hans, the apprentice, arrived, and at 8 o'clock, Toos, our lady's sales bookkeeper. Toos was a sour-faced, scowling individual whose ill temper had made it impossible for her to keep a job until, 10 years ago, she had come to work for Father. Father's gentle courtesy had disarmed and mellowed her, and though she would have died sooner than admit it, she loved him as fiercely as she disliked the rest of the world. We left Hans and Toos to answer the doorbell and went upstairs to get breakfast. Only 3 plates at the table, I thought as I set them out. The dining room was in the house at the rear, 5 steps higher than the shop, but lower than Tante Jan's rooms. To me, this room, with its single window looking into the alley, was the heart of the home. This table, with a blanket thrown over it, had made me a tent or a pirate's cove when I was small. I'd done my homework here as a schoolchild. Here, Mama read aloud from Dickens on winter evenings while the coal whistled in the brick hearth and cast a red glow over the tile, proclaiming Jesus is victor. We used only a corner of the table now, Father, Betsy, and I. But to me, the rest of the family was always there. There was Mama's chair and the 3 aunts' places over there. Not only Tante Jan's, but Mama's other 2 sisters had also lived with us. Next to me had sat my other sister, Nolly, and Willem, the only boy in the family there beside Father. Nolly and Willem had had homes of their own many years now, and Mama and the aunts were dead. But still, I seemed to see them here. Of course, their chairs hadn't stayed empty long. Father could never bear a house without children, and whenever he heard of a child in need of a home, a new face would appear at the table. Somehow, out of his watch shop that never made money, he fed and dressed and cared for 11 more children after his own 4 were grown. But now these 2 had grown up and married or gone off to work, and so I laid 3 plates on the table. Betsy brought the coffee in from the tiny kitchen, which was little more than a closet off the dining room, and took bread from the drawer in the sideboard. She was setting them on the table when we heard Father's step coming down the staircase. He went a little slowly now on the winding stairs, but still as punctual as one of his own watches. He entered the dining room, as he had every morning since I could remember, at 8:10. "Father," I said, kissing him and savoring the aroma of cigars that always clung to his long beard. "A sunny day for the party." Father's hair and beard were now as white as the best tablecloth Betsy had laid for this special day, but his blue eyes behind the thick round spectacles were as mild and merry as ever, and he gazed from one of us to the other with frank delight. "Corey, dear, my dear Betsy, how lovely you both look." He bowed his head as he sat down, said the blessing over bread, and then went on eagerly. "Your mother, how she would have loved these new styles and seeing you both looking so pretty." Betsy and I looked hard into our coffee to keep from laughing. These new styles were the despair of our young nieces, who were always trying to get us into brighter colors, shorter skirts and lower necklines. But conservative though we were, it was true that Mama had never had anything even as bright as my deep maroon dress or Betsy's dark blue one. In Mama's day, married women and unmarried ones of a certain age wore black from the chin to the ground. I had never seen Mama and the aunts in any other color. "How Mama would have loved everything about today," Betsy said. "Remember how she loved occasions? Mama could have coffee on the stove and a cake in the oven as fast as most people could say best wishes. And since she knew almost everyone in Harlem, especially the poor, sick, and neglected, there was almost no day in the year that was not for somebody, as she would say with eyes shining, a very special occasion." And so we sat over our coffee, as one should on anniversaries, and looked back to the time when Mama was alive and beyond, back to the time when Father was a small boy growing up in this same house. "I was born right in this room," he said, as though he had not told us 100 times. Only, of course, it wasn't the dining room then, but a bedroom. And the bed was in a kind of cupboard set into the wall with no windows and no light or air of any kind. "I was the first baby who lived. I don't know how many there were before me, but they all died. Mother had tuberculosis, you see, and they didn't know about contamination or keeping babies away from sick people." It was a day for memories, a day for calling up the past. How could we have guessed as we sat there, 2 middle-aged spinsters and an old man, that in this place of memories, we were about to be given adventure such as we had never dreamed of. Adventure and anguish, horror and heaven were just around the corner, and we did not know. "Oh, Father, Betsy, if I had known, would I have gone ahead? Could I have done the things I did?" But how could I know? How could I imagine this white-haired man called Opa grandfather by all the children of Harlem? How could I imagine this man thrown by strangers into a grave without a name? And Betsy, with her high lace collar and her gift for making beauty all around her? How could I picture this dearest person on earth to me, standing naked before a room full of men? In that room, on that day, such thoughts were not even thinkable. Father stood up and took the big brass-hinged Bible from its shelf as Toos and Hans rapped on the door and came in. Scripture reading at 8:30 each morning for all who were in the house, was another of the fixed points around which life in the Bay revolved. Father opened the big volume, and Betsy and I held our breaths. Surely, today of all days, when there was still so much to do, it would not be a whole chapter. But he was turning to the Gospel of Luke, where we'd left off yesterday. Such long chapters in Luke 2. With his finger at the place, Father looked up. "Where is Christoffels?" he asked. Christoffels was the third and only other employee in the shop. A bent, wizened little man who looked older than Father, though actually he was 10 years younger. I remember the day 6 or 7 years earlier when he had first come into the shop, so ragged and woebegone that I'd assumed he was one of the beggars who had the Bay marked as a sure meal. I was about to send him up to the kitchen where Betsy kept a pot of soup simmering when he announced with great dignity that he was considering permanent employment and was offering his services first to us. It turned out that Christoffels belonged to an almost vanished trade, the itinerant clockmender who trudged on foot throughout the land, regulating and repairing the tall pendulum clocks that were the pride of every Dutch farmhouse. But if I was surprised at the grand manner of this shabby little man, I was more astonished when Father hired him on the spot. "They're the finest clockmen anywhere," he told me later, "these wandering clocksmiths. There's not a repair job they haven't handled with just the tools in their sack." And so it proved through the years as people from all over Haarlem brought their clocks to him. What he did with his wages, we never knew. He had remained as tattered and threadbare as ever. Father hinted as much as he dared, for next to his shabbiness, Christoffels' most notable quality was his pride, and then gave it up. And now, for the first time ever, Christoffels was late. Father polished his glasses with his napkin and started to read, his deep voice lingering lovingly over the words. He had reached the bottom of the page when we heard Christoffels' shuffling steps on the stairs. The door opened, and all of us gasped. Christoffels was resplendent in a new black suit, new checkered vest, a snowy white shirt, flowered tie, and a stiff starched collar. I tore my eyes from the spectacle as swiftly as I could, for Christoffels' expression forbade us to notice anything out of the ordinary. "Christoffels, my dear associate," Father murmured in his formal, old-fashioned way. "What joy to see you on this, auspicious day." And hastily he resumed his Bible reading. Before he reached the end of the chapter, the doorbells were ringing, both the shop bell on the street and the family bell in the alley. Betsy ran to make more coffee and put her tartines in the oven, while Toos and I hurried to the doors. It seemed that everyone in Haarlem wanted to be first to shake Father's hand. Before long, a steady stream of guests was winding up the narrow staircase to Tante John's rooms, where Father sat almost lost in a thicket of flowers. I was helping one of the older guests up the steep stairs when Betsy seized my arm. "Corey, we're going to need Nolly's cups right away. How can we—" "I'll go get them." Our sister Nolly and her husband were coming that afternoon as soon as their 6 children got home from school. I dashed down the stairs, took my coat and my bicycle from inside the alley door, and was wheeling it over the threshold when Betsy's voice reached me, soft but firm. "Corey, your new dress." And so I whirled back up the stairs to my room, changed into my oldest skirt, and set out over the bumpy brick streets. I always loved to bike to Nolly's house. She and her husband lived about 1.5 miles from the Bay, outside the cramped old center of the city. The streets there were broader and straighter. Even the sky seemed bigger. Across the town square, I pedaled, over the canal on the Groot Hoop Bridge, and along the Wagenweg, reveling in the thin winter sunshine. Nolly lived on Bosenhovenstraat, a block of identical attached houses with white curtains and potted plants in the windows. How could I foresee as I zipped around the corner that one summer day, when the hyacinths in the commercial bulb flats nearby were ripe and brown, I would break my bicycle here and stand with my heart thudding in my throat, daring to go no closer for fear of what was taking place behind Nolly's starched curtains. Today, I careened onto the sidewalk and burst through the door with never a knock. "Nolly, the Bay-A's jammed already. You ought to see. We need the cups right now." Nolly came out of the kitchen, her round, pretty face flushed with baking. "They're all packed by the door." "Oh, I wish I could go back with you, but I've got batches of cookies still to bake, and I promised Flip and the children I'd wait for them." "You're all coming, aren't you?" "Yes, Corey. Peter will be there." Nolly was loading the cups into the bicycle bags. As a dutiful aunt, I tried to love all my nieces and nephews equally. But Peter, well, was Peter. At 13, he was a musical prodigy and a rascal, and the pride of my life. "He's even written a special song in honor of the day," Nolly said. "Here, now, you'll have to carry this bagful in your hand, so be careful." The Bay-A was more crowded than ever when I got back. The alley so jammed with bicycles, I had to leave mine at the corner. The mayor of Harlem was there in his tailcoat and gold watch chain, and the postman and the trolley motorman and half a dozen policemen from the Harlem Police Headquarters just around the corner. After lunch, the children started coming, and as children always did, they went straight to Father. The older ones sat on the floor around him. The smallest ones climbed into his lap. For in addition to his twinkling eyes and long cigar-sweet beard, Father ticked. Watches lying on a shelf run differently than watches carried about, and so Father always wore the ones he was regulating. His suit jackets had 4 huge inside pockets, each fitted with hooks for a dozen watches, so that wherever he went, the hum of hundreds of little wheels went with him. Now, with a child on each knee and 10 more crowded close, he drew from another pocket his heavy, crossed-shaped winding key, each of the 4 ends shaped for a different size lock. With a flick of his finger, he made it spin, gleaming, glinting. Betsy stopped in the doorway with a tray of cakes. "He doesn't know there's anyone else in the room," she said. I was carrying a stack of soiled plates down the stairs when a little shriek below told me that Pickwick had arrived. We used to forget, we who loved him, what a shock the first sight of him could be to a stranger. I hurried down to the door, introduced him hastily to the wife of the Amsterdam wholesale, and got him upstairs. He sank his ponderous bulk into a chair beside Father, fixed one eye on me, the other on the ceiling, and said, "5 lumps, please." Poor Pickwick. He loved children as much as Father did, but while children took to Father on sight, Pickwick had to win them. He had one trick, though, that never failed. I brought him his cup of coffee, thick with sugar, and watched him look around in mock consternation. "But my dear Cornelia," he cried, "there's no table to set it on." He glanced out of one wide-set eye to make sure the children were watching. "Well, it's a lucky thing I brought my own." And with that, he set cup and saucer on his own protruding paunch. I had never known a child who could resist it. Soon a respectful circle had gathered round him. A little later, Nolly and her family arrived. "Tante Corey," Peter greeted me innocently. "You don't look 100 years old." And before I could swat him, he was sitting at Tante Jan's upright piano, filling the house with melody. People called out requests, popular songs, selections from Bach chorales, hymns, and soon the whole room was joining in the choruses. How many of us were there that happy afternoon, who were soon to meet under very different circumstances? Peter, the policeman, dear ugly Pickwick, all of us were there except my brother Willem and his family. I wondered why they should be so late. Willem and his wife and children lived in the town of Hilversum, 30 miles away. Still, they should have been here by now. Suddenly the music stopped, and Peter, from his perch on the piano, hissed across the room, "Opa, here's the competition." I glanced out the window. Turning into the alley were Mr. and Mrs. Kahn, owners of the other watch shop on the street. By Harlem standards, they were newcomers, having opened their store in 1910, and so been on the Bottelsjoerstraat a mere 27 years. But since they sold a good many more watches than we did, I considered Peter's comment factual enough. Father, however, was distressed. Not competitors, Peter, he said reprovingly. Colleagues. And lifting children quickly off his knee, he got up and hurried to the head of the stairs to greet the Kahns. Father treated Mr. Kahn's frequent visits to the shop below as social calls from a cherished friend. Can't you see what he's doing? I would rage after Mr. Kahn had gone. He's finding out how much we're charging so he can undersell us. Mr. Kahn's display window always featured in bold figures prices exactly 5 guilders below our own. And Father's face would light up with a kind of pleased surprise, as it always did on those rare occasions when he thought about the business side of watchmaking. But Corey, people will save money when they buy from him. And then he would always add, I wonder how he does it. Father was as innocent of business know-how as his father had been before him. He would work for days on a difficult repair problem and then forget to send the bill. The more rare and expensive a watch, the less he was able to think of it in terms of money. A man should pay for the privilege of working on such a watch, he would say. As for merchandising methods, for the first 80 years of the shop's history, the shutters on the streets had been closed each evening promptly at 6. It was not until I myself had come into the business 20 years ago that I had noticed the throngs of strollers crowding the narrow sidewalks each evening, and had seen how the other stores kept their windows lighted and open. When I pointed this out to Father, he was as delighted as though I had made a profound discovery. And if people see the watches, it might make them want to buy one. Corey, my dear, how very clever you are. Mr. Kahn was making his way toward me now, full of cake and compliments. Guilty for the jealous thoughts I harbored, I took advantage of the crowd and made my escape downstairs. The workroom and shop were even more crowded with well-wishers than the upstairs rooms. Hans was passing cakes in the back room, as was Toos in the front, wearing the nearest thing to a smile that her perpetually drawn lips would permit. As for Christoffels, he had simply and astonishingly expanded. It was impossible to recognize that stooped and shabby little man in the glorious figure at the door, greeting newcomers with the formal welcome, followed by a relentless tour of the shop. Quite obviously, it was the greatest day of his life. All through the short winter afternoon, they kept coming. The people who counted themselves Father's friends, young and old, poor and rich, scholarly and gentlemen, and illiterate servant girls. Only to Father did it seem that they were all alike. That was Father's secret. Not that he overlooked the differences in people, that he didn't know they were there. And still, Wilhelm was not there. I said goodbye to some guests at the door and stood for a moment, gazing up and down the Barljorstraat. Although it was only 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the lights in the shops were coming on against the January dusk. I still had a great deal of little sister worship for this big brother, 5 years older than I, an ordained minister, and the only ten boom who had ever been to college. Willem saw things I felt. He knew what was going on in the world. Oftentimes, indeed, I wished that Willem did not quite see so well, for much that he saw was frightening. A full 10 years ago, way back in 1927, Willem had written in his doctoral thesis, done in Germany, that a terrible evil was taking root in that land. Right at the university, he said, seeds were being planted of a contempt for human life such as the world had never seen. The few who had read his paper laughed. Now, of course, people weren't laughing about Germany. Most of the good clocks came from there, and recently several firms with whom we had dealt for years were simply and mysteriously out of business. Willem believed it was part of a deliberate and large-scale move against the Jews. Every one of the closed businesses was Jewish. As head of the Dutch Reformed Church's program to reach Jews, Wilhelm kept in touch with these things. Dear Willem, I thought, as I stepped back inside and closed the door. He was about as good of a salesman of the church as Father was of watches. If he'd converted a single Jew in 20 years, I hadn't heard about it. Willem didn't try to change people, just to serve them. He had scrimped and saved enough money to build a home for elderly Jews in Hilversum. for the elderly of all faiths, in fact, for Willem was against any system of segregation. But in the last few months, the home had been deluged with younger arrivals, all Jews, and all from Germany. Willem and his family had given up their own living quarters and were sleeping in a corridor. And still the frightened, homeless people kept coming, and with them tales of a mounting madness. I went up to the kitchen where Nolly had just brewed a fresh pot of coffee, picked it up, and continued with it upstairs to Tante John's rooms. "What does he want?" I asked a group of men gathering around the cake table as I set down the pot. "This man in Germany, does he want war?" I knew it was poor talk for party, but somehow thoughts of Willem always set my mind on hard subjects. Guessing it's that time. Y'all can go.